Live from Jaffa, this is i24 News. I'm Michelle Divon, and you're watching the Daily Beat. Let's get to our top story. We're beginning here in the Middle East, where Israel's Air Force reportedly attacked military targets in Syria's Damascus and a Hezbollah weapons convoy along the highway connecting Damascus to Beirut. The reports were made in Arab media, and Syria's government has confirmed that Israel was indeed behind the attacks. i24 News' Chloe Liu brings us the story, and then we'll break it down in studio.
The Israeli border with Syria, usually quiet, has been heating up. According to Arab media, Israeli forces conducted a series of airstrikes in the Damascus area overnight. Israeli aircraft reportedly bombed a military position, possibly a weapons warehouse, near the Syrian capital. Following that strike, Israeli warplanes allegedly blew up a Hezbollah weapons convoy on its way to Lebanon. And Lebanon claims that Israel was operating in its airspace overnight. Local residents say they heard 4 explosions at around 1:15 in the morning. Israel has stated a policy of preventing Hezbollah from getting a hold of advanced arms, but does not comment on such military operations. Syria, however, has confirmed the attack.
So there is a tacit understanding that as long as Bashar Assad can save face, but not having to confront the fact that Syrian sovereignty is being violated by Israel.
Allegations of these new airstrikes follow a bout of border skirmishes earlier in the week, as Israel confirmed that it targeted an Islamic State post along the border in response to mortar fire.
We are well prepared on our northern frontier. We will not allow Islamic State or any other faction to establish a presence near our borders.
Israel periodically responds to spillover from the Syrian civil war, but intentional fire is far less common.
And we're joined in studio by our senior defense correspondent, Shai Ben-Ari. Shai, thanks for being here. So Israel does not comment on such activity as mentioned in the report. Do we know if this is a policy that's actually being practiced?
It really is a policy, you could say. When it comes to these kinds of reports, Israel does not tend to confirm, at least immediately after, and that has been the case so far. This is opposed to other kinds of strikes in Syrian territory, which we've seen a lot of. That really come in retaliation to the kind of spillover we've seen, whether intentional or not, across the border. Israel then does also tend to strike and then does make it very public, coming out with a statement that its sovereignty must be respected and that it holds the Syrian regime responsible. When it comes to these kinds of reports, we see much of a lower public profile. But Prime Minister Netanyahu has admitted in the past that Israel has operated in these kinds of contexts in Syrian territory with the red line.
Never specifically admitting to a specific incident, but saying that Israel does operate. What do we know, however, about the type of weapons Israel targets, if we do?
Right. There's specific concern about advanced weaponry, mainly in the field of air defense, falling into the hands of Hezbollah, and that has really been underlined as a red line by Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying something that is something that Israel cannot accept. And also it's known that there is a certain understanding between Israel and the Kremlin regarding that specific point. And it's interesting to note several things here. No injuries or human casualties here. We know that there is that mechanism of communication when it comes to Israel's operations in Syrian territory. The Russians are coordinated with. And
so what kind of message is Israel sending, and who is this message aimed towards?
Right. It's aimed, of course, to Hezbollah and the Syrian regime when it comes to making those weapons transfers to that organization. But when you take into context the advanced air defense systems that the Russians have in Syria, you're talking about very advanced capabilities. They're aware of every Israeli plane that takes off. They're also basically capable of taking down those planes. So they don't want any misunderstanding here. That's why that mechanism of communication exists. And it's interesting to note in that respect that there were no injuries. It's possible that the Russians relayed a certain warning to people on the ground to get out of the way. That's interesting to take into account. But I would think that the Russians themselves are not enthusiastic about those capabilities falling into the hands of Hezbollah, an organization which they are perhaps allied to a certain degree with in terms of their interests in Syria, but an organization that they want to keep under control. They don't want it getting out of hand.
Which is why they would allow certain operations. Now, looking at the Assad regime, which very quickly came out to say that that Israel was indeed behind this, is there a certain incentive, do you think, in Syria to blame Israel at this time?
It's a very tricky sort of balance. The Assad regime maybe has to make it clear that it won't accept this kind of thing. We saw a few months ago there was an incident where the Assad regime's own defense systems, air defense systems, were activated apparently in relation to some sort of Israeli craft operating in the skies above. There was no damage done, no planes were hit. quiet, but the Assad regime has to at least make the appearance that they are not accepting this, even though I doubt we will see any major retaliatory strike coming from the Assad regime. They, of course, have their own problems, and there's not a lot they can do about it, frankly.
Sure, with all the chaos in Syria. Meanwhile, Israeli lawmakers have postponed holding 2 votes that were scheduled for today. One dual vote that was aimed to legalize West Bank settler outposts, one that will include the authorization of the Amona settlement to avoid its evacuation later this month, and one which will not. The vote on the second bill, known as the Muazzin bill, has also been postponed to a later date, and this just happened this past hour. We're going to go now live to the Knesset, to Israel's parliament, where our diplomatic correspondent Eli Hochenberg is standing by. Eli, what's the latest there?
Yes, Michal, well, it was expected to be an extremely stormy day here at the parliament, but at the end, the coalition decided to push back these 2 extremely controversial motions. First and foremost, the so-called Amana bill, the regulation bill, aimed at normalizing the status of several outposts throughout the country, but most importantly, the disputed Amona outpost in the West Bank. And there are still many skeptic voices within the ruling coalition, most notably Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who decided today during a cabinet meeting to postpone the vote till Monday, and until then we'll continue to look for other ways to resolve this issue, and we'll try to work together with legal authorities, which also highly oppose this motion, and get a different solution. Hawkish forces within the government, led by Education Minister Naftali Bennett, leader of the Jewish Home Party, are still very much determined to put this legislation forward. And again, the coalition have several days to decide what will be its stance on this very disputed matter. It is important to mention that earlier today, the committee overlooking this bill decided to present 2 different versions of the bill, one that includes Amona and one that fails to include it, and that in order to help the skeptics to vote in favor of this motion. And then the bill will go back to the committee, and by the time of the second and third readings, the committee will have to decide about one coherent version of the bill. But as said, Prime Minister Netanyahu will try to look for other solutions until this bill will be put forward.
And Eddie, Netanyahu warned that these bills, if passed, they could endanger Israeli lawmakers at the International Criminal Court. Do you think this could perhaps be another reason why these bills have been postponed? From what I understood, from what you said, Netanyahu is trying to reach a certain agreement before the bill is actually put up to a vote.
Yeah, well, Netanyahu is at a very delicate situation at the moment. On the one hand, he knows that such a motion will trigger a massive international uproar, whether it's the U.S., the legal authorities, the international legal authorities, or simply Israel's allies. But on the other hand, we have political pressures, again, most notably by the hawkish Jewish Home Party, that in the last elections lost many votes of the settlers to Netanyahu, and this is something they're not willing to let happen again, and this is why they're pushing this bill so passionately forward. But Netanyahu does not want first to lose this electorate, and second to shake his already shaky coalition. So again, a very sensitive situation for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and in the coming days he will try to find a solution that will satisfy both sides.
Eli, do stay with us. I want to get a reaction here from our senior correspondent, Shai Ben-Ari. Shai, the police right now, the Israeli police, is preparing for the removal of Amona, for its dismantling, and they're expecting a lot of resistance and violence. We're seeing now pictures behind you from the 2006 evacuation.
It's a very delicate operation. The police and the security apparatus in general wants as much time as possible to really prepare for this, because we're talking about something that could get very violent indeed. You know, the name Amona itself is a very charged one when you talk about the historical collective memory in Israel, with that very violent forced eviction back in February 2006. There was also a very charged sort of political buildup in the lead up to that situation, where you had eventually 4,000 protesters come in and try to really prevent the eviction itself. They were not successful. They brought in, there were 4,000 protesters, but there were 10,000 security personnel, mainly border police, and they may come to a very similar situation this time around. That's why it's such a sensitive issue. Back then, 300 people were injured, including Knesset members. And despite all of the protests, several houses were indeed demolished, despite everything that went down there. It's really one of the more traumatic experiences, you could say, definitely for the settler movement that came also just a few months after the eviction of settlements in the Gaza Strip.
Sure, which brings back those memories as well, and a very big split within Israeli society. Thanks, Shai, for this. Now, Guatemala and Israel signed a new cooperation agreement in Jerusalem. Guatemala's president, Jimmy Morales, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu signed the accord, this after holding a joint news conference in the capital.
There's a larger picture that I began speaking to you about, and that is our interest in entering in a big way Latin America. Latin America has always been friendly to Israel, but I think we're in a position where these relationships can be far, far, far advanced. And I look forward to visiting Latin America and perhaps Guatemala, since you just kindly gave me an invitation.
And we're jumping back now to Jerusalem to our diplomatic correspondent, Eli Hochenberg. Eli, it seems that Israel is aiming for new strategic partnerships in Latin America.
Absolutely. We've seen this refreshing policy on behalf of Jerusalem in recent months to expand or broaden its international ties. We've seen it with African countries, with Eastern Europe, and now, of course, with Latin America. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expected to have many foreign visits in the coming months, and he already said that Latin America is definitely on the table as well. So, again, shifting from the more traditional allies, such as Western European countries and the U.S., and expanding Israel's international network, most notably in order to strengthen Israel's position in international bodies, of course, the UN at the top.
And Eli, you have Knesset member Yehuda Glick there with you.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yes, so Parliament member Yehuda Glick is here with me to discuss another controversial bill that was not put forward today, the Muazzin bill. And thank you, Mr. Glick, for joining us. And you tweeted earlier today an interesting suggestion to solve this contentious issue. So first, what's your take on the current legislation and why do you think it's so controversial? And then please explain your creative solution to the situation.
Okay, I actually spoke today to the Prime Minister and to the chairman of the spokesman speaker of the Knesset about the idea. And let's start from the beginning. The intention of those who put down this legislation was actually pure, simple legislation to prevent the interfering or the bothering of the muazzin call in the mosques that were calling at 4 a.m., waking people up, children, and etc. That was the major intention. As the I would say the move started being promoted, the back sounds were growing and growing, and many Muslims felt that this legislation was an anti-Muslim legislation, even though again and again we repeated it's not. But sometimes people, when they hear, they're not rational, and from the very beginning, the Israeli government today, the coalition, is like suspicious of being anti-Arab or anti-Muslim. And therefore, it reached a point where it was already the effectivity of this legislation was going to be coming back to us at a boomerang. And people were saying, we're not going to keep the law, we're not going to... And therefore, I went to approach the Prime Minister today, and I approached the chair, the Speaker of the Knesset, and I said, listen, let's establish a team, let's establish a committee made up of qadis, of sheikhs, of Muslim religious leaders, and they will receive, and these are people that on the one hand are not suspicious of being people anti-Muslim, on the other hand are aware of the attraction that this noise causes to parents and children. And just like I am always doing, whatever I do is my main goal is to solve the issue, and on the other hand to do it through the dialogue and not through coercion.
But can't you understand, Mr. Glick, as a religious man, why Muslims can be offended by such a bill?
Look, you have to understand the bill that was brought here is a cut copy exactly of a bill that exists in Egypt, in Turkey, in Dubai, in Holland, in France. None of these countries are anti-Muslim. So the bill in itself is definitely not an anti-Muslim. I'm going to say more than that. If any place people blow the shofar at 4 a.m., I would also say stop. You shouldn't do it if it's people living there right near. People, even in their religious life. Another religious value is to care about others, and therefore the bill is not an anti-Muslim bill. But after the propaganda around it, and it turned into something that was referred to as an anti-Muslim, I said, since we all want the good of the whole thing, we want to respect all religions, we want to respect the rights of the Muslims to call people to the prayer, I think if we do it through dialogue, the benefits will be much greater than the benefits of forcing people and getting them feeling offended.
Well, Mr. Glick, hopefully your idea will be gaining traction.
So.
Thank you very much for your time. Michelle, back to you in the studio.
Thank you very much, Elliot. It's important to know that Yehuda Glick is also an activist working to get more access for Jewish worshippers to the Temple Mount. Now we're moving to Turkey, where a constitutional draft will be introduced to the Turkish parliament in the next 2 weeks. This will be formally cementing President Tayyip Erdogan's powers by the creation of an executive presidency. Erdogan has long sought constitutional change to strengthen what had been in the past a largely ceremonial position. Meanwhile, Erdogan also urged Muslims to defend the Palestinian cause, striking a tough stance on Israel despite improved ties between the two nations. The Turkish leader also criticized Israel's so-called Muezzin bill. And we're going to go now live to Ankara, where we're joined by journalist Ziya Veyse. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So what kind of executive powers will this give the president?
Well, the Constitution itself will not automatically pass. It's not something that will necessarily happen. If it does pass, and it first needs to clear a lot of parliamentary hurdles. It would need to clear a nationwide referendum. It would give Erdogan powers that have previously been the powers of parliament and the prime minister. So he will be able to issue executive orders that have previously, a power that was previously with the parliament.
But Erdogan does enjoy very high popularity rates at the moment. So what support exactly does he need within the government in order to gain this majority that you speak of to pass the bill?
Well, so there's 550 seats in parliament, and Erdogan's party, the AKP, holds a majority. However, it does not hold the necessary 2/3 of seats that are needed to immediately pass a bill, or at 330 seats, put the bill to a referendum nationwide. So he needs the support of an opposition party, or at least 13 opposition MPs. And he thinks that he might be able to get that support from the Nationalist Party, which is its ideology closest to Erdogan's AKP.
Confirmed the attack.
So there is a tacit understanding that as long as Bashar Assad can save face, but not having to confront the fact that Syrian sovereignty is being violated by Israel.
Allegations of these new airstrikes follow a bout of border skirmishes earlier in the week, as Israel confirmed that it targeted an Islamic State post along the border in response to mortar fire.
We are well prepared on our northern frontier. We will not allow Islamic State or any other faction to establish a presence near our borders.
Israel periodically responds to spillover from the Syrian civil. Arab media, Israeli forces conducted a series of airstrikes in the Damascus area overnight. Israeli aircraft reportedly bombed a military position, possibly a weapons warehouse, near the Syrian capital. Following that strike, Israeli warplanes allegedly blew up a Hezbollah weapons convoy on its way to Lebanon. And Lebanon claims that Israel was operating in its airspace overnight. Local residents say they heard 4 explosions at around 1:15 in the morning. Israel has stated a policy of preventing Hezbollah from getting a hold of advanced arms, but does not comment on such military operations. Syria, however, has confirmed war, but intentional fire is far less common.
And we're joined in studio by our senior defense correspondent, Shai Ben-Ari. Shai, thanks for being here. So Israel does not comment on such activity as mentioned in the report. Do we know if this is a policy that's actually being practiced?
It really is a policy, you could say. When it comes to these kinds of reports, Israel does not tend to confirm, at least immediately after, and that has been the case so far. This is opposed to other kinds of strikes in Syrian territory, which we've seen a lot of, that really come in retaliation to the kind of spillover we've seen, whether intentional or not, across the border. Israel then does also tend to strike and then does make it very public.
Live from Jaffa, this is i24 News. I'm Michelle Divon, and you're watching the Daily Beat. Let's get to our top story. We're beginning here in the Middle East, where Israel's Air Force reportedly attacked military targets in Syria's Damascus and a Hezbollah weapons convoy along the highway connecting Damascus to Beirut. The reports were made in Arab media, and Syria's government has confirmed that Israel was indeed behind the attacks. i24 News' Chloe Liu brings us the story, and then we'll break it down in studio.
The Israeli border with Syria, usually quiet, has been heating up, according to...
Coming out with a statement that its sovereignty must be respected and that it holds the Syrian regime responsible. When it comes to these kinds of reports, we see much of a lower public profile. But Prime Minister Netanyahu has admitted in the past that Israel has operated in these kinds of contexts in Syrian territory with the red line.
Never specifically admitting to a specific incident, but saying that Israel does operate. What do we know, however, about the type of weapons Israel targets, if we do?
Right. There's specific concern about advanced weaponry, mainly in the field of air defense, falling into the hands of Hezbollah, and that has really been underlined as a red line by Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying that is something that Israel cannot accept.